Okay, sorry, I was looking down there for a second, wasn't I? We are on Evaluating Social Theories, which is Chapter 8, which was the short chapter after that long one. It'll be a couple sit-downs for me. But this is where he begins to make his argument for I forgot the way he divided his categories of anarchism, but a pragmatic anarchism, perhaps. He says, in the chapters to follow, I ask the reader to consider a broad theory of how society ought to be organized. And if you hear that heater in the background, I'm sorry, it was snowing today. You can take the girl out of Florida, but you can't take the Florida out of the girl. So, rational, the subtitle, rational evaluation is comparative. We often decide whether to adopt a course of action by asking simply whether the action is good or bad. But the more appropriate question is whether the action is better or worse than the alternatives. And he clarifies quite quickly. I state this point this way for simplicity of expression. I do not intend, however, to presuppose consequentialism. For cases in which non-consequentialist duties apply, what matters is whether an action does a better job of satisfying one's prima facie duties than the available alternatives. For instance, whether I should break a promise depends upon whether my available alternatives would violate duties more stringent than the duty to keep that promise. And he says a corollary is that our standard for evaluating social theories ought not to be one of perfection. Boy, how many times do I say that? Perfection is not an option. Perfection is not on the table. We ought not, that is, to reject a proposed social structure because under it, some people will suffer from some social problems. Perfection is not one of the available options for human societies. We ought to reject the social system if and only if we can identify a superior alternative. And I agree with him if he means it in the non-consequentialist sense that he said before. And then next subtitle. Rational evaluation is comprehensive. When evaluating a social system, we must consider all of the advantages and disadvantages of that system. We should not allow our evaluation to be unduly influenced by any single social issue. And boy, this happens so much. And he gives a really good example that I'm going to read in full. Imagine a social activist, whom I shall call Mom, whose favorite social issue is drunk driving. She attends rallies against drunk driving, quotes statistics about the problem to her friends, and writes letters to her congressman and the local newspapers urging tougher laws to combat drunk driving. Mom knows that there are many other serious social problems. Nevertheless, none call forth from her the same passion. This sort of phenomena, I trust, is familiar enough. Every social issue has its moms. Suppose, furthermore, that Mom becomes convinced that anarchy, while it may adequately address every other problem, cannot address the problem of drunk driving nearly as well as some governmental system. As a result, Mom finds herself unable to accept anarchism. The story of Mom is meant to illustrate a psychological point. We have emotional attachments to specific social issues, which are often disproportionate to the objective significance of those issues, and these emotional attachments can bias our evaluation of social theories. Thinkers must become aware of this problem to guard against it. We must recognize the possibility that the system that is overall best for society may not solve all the problems and may not solve the problems to which we, I added personally feel, but we feel the greatest psychological commitment. Next subtitle is Varieties of Government and Anarchy. It goes, in comparing government with anarchy, we should examine the best feasible form of government, because as some of the part I skipped over, he pointed out that government by itself, it's a very equivocal term. Like, Kim Jong-un, that's government, and then so is President Biden. The two are not equivalent. So If it does not matter if we also have some terrible form of government that we would never want to adopt, unless, having decided to have a government, we lack control of what form of government we get. Hereinafter, I shall assume without argument that the best form of government is representative democracy. The same point applies to the other term of the comparison. Anarchist theorists need not defend any and all non-governmental conditions. They need defend only some feasible non-governmental social structure. It does not matter if, in addition, there are terrible forms of anarchy that we would never want, unless, again, we lack control of which form of anarchy we get. I just laughed. This is the weirdness of that sentence. We lack control over the type of anarchy that we get. I don't know if that sentence strikes anyone else as really funny, but to me it's really funny. Next subsection is against status quo bias. Most human beings invents a marked tendency to view the present arrangements in their own society, whatever they may be, as right and good. The bias explains how people from extremely different cultures can each regard their own culture's practices as the best. One potential form of status quo bias is the practice of assigning a heavy burden of proof to anyone who proposes a new social system very different from the present system. And we who argue for anarchy find that a lot. Like, they put requirements on our proof that they'd never put on their own. Next subsection, a simplified conception of human nature. So he then goes on to give his views of human nature and a slight defense of it. For instance, humans are approximately rational. It says, the assumption of instrumental rationality is most likely to hold good when people are facing simple, familiar situations in which the best option is easy to work out. It is also very likely to hold for managers of businesses and competitive industries. Businesses that are managed irrationally will tend to underperform rationally managed businesses. The latter will thus expand while the former shrink until the market is dominated by relatively rational businesses. I gotta run downstairs and do a show. It's funny, I'm doing a lot of recording tonight, so I will pick this up. We don't got very much more to go in this chapter, though there is a large section that I'm going to be reading in full that I thought he did so well with dealing with utopianism. All right. See you in a bit. To you, it'll seem like just a second. I'm back even quicker than I thought. My show doesn't start for another 15 minutes, so I've got a little bit more I can do. Whew, and I ran up the stairs. I'm out of breath. It says humans are, the next subpoint, humans are aware of their environment. It says when information is easily and cheaply acquired, easy to understand, and relevant to achieving our goals, whew, I'm out of breath, then we will generally have that information. And it is particularly likely that managers of businesses and competitive industries will possess accurate information relevant to managing their businesses, since the businesses whose managers remain ignorant of such information will tend to underperform the businesses whose managers are well informed, allowing the latter businesses over time to dominate the industry. It was really interesting to me because I thought he'd get into businesses a lot more in this section, considering how, well, I suppose it will become very important later. But in the short section on human nature, I expected it more to deal with social structures rather than businesses. But anyway. Next, humans are selfish, but not sociopathic. I loved this section. Though I disagree with him in his estimation of just how selfish. But we'll go with what he has to say. He gives a story about how once he splurged on a coat for $200, even though he had a coat already at home, and that money, how much good of use it could have been put towards even saving lives in a third world country, but he selfishly spent it on himself. And then he goes on to say that humans generally are pretty selfish, and unless someone is watching, really don't give away very much or help very much. At least that's the general gist. I disagree with him with that pessimistic view, but if that's the presuppositions he's coming into his argument with, at least he's not overstating his case. And he doesn't view it as overly pessimistic, just realistic and not sociopathic. So he goes on to say, while ordinary human beings are willing to make very little positive effort to aid others with whom they lack close relationships, they tend also to be reluctant to directly attack other human beings or to positively violate generally accepted social norms in other ways, even when they stand to gain by doing so. So he's talking about the strong presupposition to honor negative rights. So our disposition, and I suppose a statist could use this as an argument for the state that we have to force people to help each other, but then we start getting into instrumentalism, I guess, and consequentialism. And if you believe that it's prima facie wrong to coerce other people, even with the limited exceptions he gives, that would not be an option. So he says, next subtitle, On Behalf of Simplification. And he just goes on to say his very simplified view of human nature is very, very predictive over time. And he gives a historical application that I'd like to read in full, or almost in full at least. An interesting but little known illustration is provided by America's first experiment with communism, which took place at Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in America. When the colony was established in 1607, its founding charter stipulated that each colonist would be entitled to an equal share of the colony's product, regardless of how much that individual personally produced. The result? The colonists did little work and little food was produced. Of the 104 founding colonists, 2/3 died in the first year, partly due to unclean water, but mostly due to starvation. More colonists arrived from England, so that in 1609 there were 500 colonists. Of those, only 60 survived the winter of 1609 through 10. In 1611, England sent a new governor, Sir Thomas Dale, who found the skeletal colonists bowling in the streets instead of working. Their main source of food was wild plants and animals, which they gathered secretly at night so as to evade the obligation to share with their neighbors. Dale later converted the colony to a system based on private property, granting every colonist a 3-acre plot to tend for his own individual benefit. The result was a dramatic increase in production. So, in the last section here, and this we will probably have to get back to, and actually we will, because I want to read this in full, but it is the section on utopianism and realism. Okay, probably maybe I'll record it later tonight, so maybe I won't be in a different outfit, but maybe I will. You just never know. Okay, here I am back for the final installment. So, the last section is called Utopianism and Realism. And there's a lot here. See, I don't know if you could see all the highlighting I did. But it's the last few pages. But this is why I saved it for its own section. The principle of realism. When proposed political and social arrangements are criticized, it's usually for being harmful or unjust. But sometimes a vision of society is both perfectly just and highly beneficial, and yet we reject it on the grounds that the idea is too unrealistic or utopian. Consider, for example, a position we might call utopian socialism. The utopian socialist holds that everyone should be paid equally, regardless of productivity. In the last section, we saw that arrangements of this kind can lead to underproduction, putting things mildly. The utopian socialist addresses this problem by simply proposing that we all henceforth agree to behave selflessly. If we all voluntarily work our hardest for the good of society, then there will be no problem. Granted, this has not happened in the past. Nevertheless, says the utopian socialist, it is what ought to happen. Intuitively, this idea is defective as a political and social philosophy, regardless of whether the society it depicts is just or desirable, because the idea is too unrealistic. It seems to call for an alteration in a robust aspect of human nature without proposing a plausible mechanism for bringing this about. Many people believe that anarchism, too, falls to the charge of excessive utopianism. These critics accuse anarchists of relying upon unrealistically optimistic assumptions about human nature. How can we avoid this objection? I never found that objection terribly persuasive, but a lot of people do. And if I had thought socialism was ethical, not talking about desirable or any of this here, I wouldn't let the fact that it hasn't happened in the past dissuade me either, because I do think people morally evolve. I mean, there were thousands of years where slavery was just a fact of existence and it never had not existed. So for people to propose, how about we stop doing this, that seemed pretty utopian as well. But he finds that to be a weighty objection, but yet is an anarchist, so he's going to address these, so that's good. I mean, I'd like to know the arguments against it, even if they don't trouble me personally. Prescription for a realistic anarchism. To avoid excessive utopianism, we should respect the following constraints. Number 1, we may not assume unrealistic levels of altruistic motivation. In examining the advantages and disadvantages of the system, we must assume that the anarchist society will be populated by people with relatively normal levels of selfishness, and we must accept the consequences of that selfishness within the particular social structure. Number 2, we may not assume perfect rationality or knowledge. Our defense of anarchism must be consistent with the fact that people periodically make mistakes. Number 3, we may not assume psychological uniformity. We must recognize the fact that human beings have a variety of motivations and character traits. For example, some individuals are unusually aggressive or reckless. 4, we may not simply assume persistence of the system over time. Rather, we must be able to argue that, once adopted, the system would be able to resist forces that might be thought to undermine it. 5, we may not assume simultaneous worldwide adoption of the system, since there is no plausible way in which that could come about. We must imagine that, perhaps as a transitional stage, some limited region or group becomes anarchist in a world otherwise dominated by states. On the other hand, it's worth noting two things that do not render a social theory overly utopian. 1, if a theory cannot be implemented simply in the sense that people cannot be convinced to implement it, this does not render the theory too utopian. And he gives some example, but the title, I think, is the summary, I think, is just fine. Number 2, to be sufficiently realistic, a model for society need not be feasible or desirable under all social conditions. It need only be argued that there are some conditions likely to be realized now or in the future under which the model would succeed. In subsequent chapters, then, I shall attempt to characterize a kind of anarchist society that would be stable and livable under some realistic conditions, despite the existence of criminals, dissidents, ordinary human selfishness, and foreign governments. And then his last subtitle here, Against Utopian Statism. It is widely recognized that anarchists face a significant challenge of avoiding utopianism. It is widely recognized as well that some non-anarchist theories, such as certain forms of socialism, face charges of utopianism. What is less well recognized is that even very conventional, moderate political theories can be utopian. The distinction between utopianism and realism chiefly concerns, roughly, whether a political or social idea requires violations of human nature. A mainstream political view might turn out to require such violations, while some radical alternative does not. It is perfectly possible for a small change to be unfeasible, while some much larger change is feasible. One common form of utopianism excuse me, consists of confusing the way individuals and organizations are supposed to behave with the way they will behave. When social systems are evaluated, it does not matter how a system is supposed to work. What matters is how it can be expected to work under realistic assumptions about human nature. For example, we can say that the function of government is to protect the rights of its citizens, but nothing follows from this about what government will actually do. That is a powerful, powerful statement. A related form of utopianism consists of suspending general assumptions about human nature when considering agents of the state. It seems to have simply never occurred to most statists to apply realistic assumptions about human nature to the government itself. The state is treated as if it stood above the empirical human world, transcending not only the moral constraints, but also the psychological forces that apply to individual human beings. Because, that was a summary statement, but he was addressing the argument that, people are, the circle, people are bad, therefore we need a government made up of people who are bad, therefore we need a government. If people are so bad they need a government, who are you going to get to populate this government? The same people you say are so bad? What makes you think that just becoming an agent of the state won't make them even worse? And I think history has shown us it in fact does. So that's the end of that chapter. We're going to move on to chapter 9 in the next installment. Then, as I tend to do, we look ahead. Chapter 9 is entitled The Logic of Predation. And this chapter is slightly longer. So let's see how many pages we have to look forward to here. I think it's about 30. Yep, 30 pages. And that seems to be more of a typical chapter. That chapter 7 was super, super long. All right. Hope you'd enjoyed it.